Well, it's a great delight to be here. My first visit to Leuven, and it's really a pleasure and a privilege and an honour to be here. I'm going to talk in a very, you might say, abstract way about the university, but I always try to say on these occasions that what I want to say comes out of my own experience as much as anything else. So it's very much autobiography in a way. My writing and my reflections is just a space that I create for myself to work out the angst that I feel about university life sometimes. I'm really sorry, I'm just a typical Brit who can only speak in English, so you'll have to forgive my linguistic failings. Let's get cracking. By the way, how long have we got? How long do you want me to talk for?
An hour.
Okay, all crumbs.
More or less
If you get tired or just feel you want a bit of discussion, don't be afraid of heckling. Yes, we have time, I think, for questions and answers anyway. But if I'm sitting there, I get rather bored if somebody's talking for an hour. So don't be afraid of speaking out. Policy, what policy? What does it mean to have a policy, a national policy, in relation to universities, the university sector? That's the question I want to pose. For half of my life I was a bureaucrat, actually. I only became a university lecturer in my mid-40s. And so I'm quite interested in the formation of policy, and in fact, even more recently, as one went up the greasy pole, do you have that expression, something like it? One inevitably finds oneself in managerial leadership and policy forming positions. So I'm quite intrigued by the notion of policy in relation to the university sector. What could it mean? And I'm not a policy analyst as such, and in fact I don't know anything about the literature on policy and policy formation and policy analysis. So this is very much informal thinking, as it were, off the top of my head. Well, just beginning thoughts really, nothing new here, just remembering, as it were, a memoir, what the situation is these days. There is very little, I think, common agreement as to what it is to be a university these days, and it's fascinating being invited to go around the world and seeing the differences that there are and the way those differences are unfolding. But at the same time, it seems to me there are massive common universal forces at work underlying the differences. And there's nothing new here, this is just a memoir stuff. Entrepreneurialism, the formation of the entrepreneurial university, global knowledge economy, increasing concern with research, but not only research in itself, but wanting to ensure that research has an impact. Have you got something like that on your public agenda here in Belgium, the impact of research? It's a big political issue in the UK. Internationalisation, I've just been to Malaysia. I've been a guest of Curtin University. Curtin University is an Australian university. We've got a massive campus in Malaysia. So we're seeing signs of internationalisation, cross-national collaboration going on across the world. A vocabulary around excellence, usually backed by national audit agencies. Concern with learning, but now learning conceived of as skills, and skills not in a general sense, but very specifically in relation to the economy. Concerns with students in a more marketised age. Have you got, as we've got in the UK, concerns with student satisfaction? I always say I'm not in the business of attending to student satisfaction. I'm not trying to satisfy students. If I'm a teacher, I don't do so much of that these days. But it seems to me that that's a totally inadequate way of understanding the challenge of teaching. But nevertheless, it's part of the political agenda and vocabulary, the satisfying students. Huge new developments going on in the use of new technologies, the formation of MOOCs and supercomputing in relation to research, academic staff seen as resources to be managed, growth of the private sector, personal benefits of higher education played up, and a diminution, a lessening of an interest in the public benefits of higher education, and concern in general with change and innovation. That just seems to me to be part of the landscape that we're in. And I don't know if that rings bells with you in Belgium, but actually I think this is becoming part of the landscape of higher education almost across the world, even, if I can say so, in China. To a large degree. So there seems to be something of a global consensus emerging across the world as to the policy landscape. Now I use that term for the first time, policy landscape of higher education. And one sees it, I'm fortunate to be invited around the world, but when you see it in the discourse around the world, from Beijing to Washington, London to Santiago, Bonn, Brussels to Ottawa, where I was recently, Johannesburg to Canberra. It's quite extraordinary how politicians and the senior planners, there's a kind of coterie, there's a kind of club, and they fly around the world and they go to transnational seminars and meetings, and they look at OECD data and things of that kind. There's a club, they can all speak the same language, and it's this language, the language of understanding, taking for granted what higher education is, and what a university is. And so we have mantras which are imbibed all around the world of access and diversity and impact and world class. Do you have a phrase like that? World class. You heard the phrase world class universities, and in their web pages, universities will pump themselves up as being world class. University of excellence. It's a common language that's developing, and of course encouraged by the World League Tables. I'm sure the rector of Leuven nervously looks at the league tables every year when they come out, or whenever it is. Where is my university in the league tables? But it may be that within this overall global, and it's a global policy landscape, I think, that's developing here, there are inattentions which are probably not always recognised or certainly not fully understood, I think. There are tensions between higher education as a bureaucracy on the one hand, and higher education as an entrepreneurial site. Universities are being charged with becoming entrepreneurial, generating their own income, being fleet-footed, and yet universities are very solid bureaucracies. I don't know what it's like in Belgium, but now in the USA and in the UK, academics are a dying species. There are fewer academics, would you believe, in British and American universities than there are non-academics. And this is testimony to the way in which universities have become bureaucracies. At the same time, they're supposed to be entrepreneurial, seizing the main chance, and so on and so forth. We have another tension, which I think hasn't been addressed in the literature, and that's between what I'm calling particularities and universalities. University, the very term university, the core of the word, and you see it in languages, different languages, stands for universality of some kind, or universalities, plural, of some kind. We're not quite sure what they are. But still there is that lurking feeling that universities do stand for universal ideas of truth, goodness even, of reason. And yet they're being charged all the time to attend to their region, to local problems, to particular problems of the age. So there's this tension between particularities and universalities. And then between what we might call an internalist conception of the university and externalist conceptions of the university. The external conceptions of the university are the ones that are being driven hard these days. Universities are being charged with trying to see themselves in relation to the wider society, the wider world. That's how they're being enjoined to position themselves. And yet perhaps there are still lurking, if we go into classrooms, if we go and talk to academics, if we look at the journals, there are still internalist conceptions of the university at work as people concern themselves with the epistemologies of their subjects, with the pedagogical relationship with trying to help students develop as people. So you've got this tension playing out between internalist and externalist conceptions. Public and private. Not sure again how that plays out in Belgium. It plays out, I think, in rather particular ways and quite intricate ways. A university like Leuven itself, you have this tension playing out between public and private. And then the uniformity of world-classness. Universities around the world want to tell the world that they are world-class. And yet they're also supposed to identify their particular strengths, to demonstrate the diversity of universities within a national system. And then another tension between institutional autonomy and state steering. Don't want to get hung up on those. I'm simply saying that underneath this broad global discourse, broad policy discourse, there are actually tensions that we ought perhaps to be alert to. But I just want to come back to the global discourse that I've been talking about, identifying. I want to say there is a global discursive regime, to use a Foucauldian term here. Global discursive regime, which, as I say, the politicians, the planners, the think tank people can all speak and understand each other. They speak the same language. It seems that there is this global policy framework developing. Or is it perhaps rather, we might say more, taken for granted set of axioms and assumptions which are not really being interrogated as much as they should be? And perhaps we understand that then as a reflection, as I say, of massive global forces that we might summarise as global digital capitalism. I mean, if it's the case, there is this policy, this global policy framework developed, we've got to ask ourselves how and why it is developing as a global policy framework. And so I think we've got to look at massive global forces at work, and hence my summary there in that phrase, global digital capitalism. Have you come across the phrase learning analytics? New kid on the vocabulary block. We have so much data now, not only on universities but on students. We can now interrogate every movement that students make in terms of their attendance at classes. And of course, if they're engaging in social networking, if they're engaging in internet discourses, we can capture how many times they engage in those discourses, to what end, to what effect. So university administrations are developing massive sets of data on their students. Students, it seems to me, I was reflecting on this on the train coming here today, are just becoming, as it were, digital ciphers. They're simply a set of digital displays, as it were. They're losing their humanity because of the power and intrusiveness and intensity of this digital revolution that's taking place. It's becoming a very powerful tool to university administrations. So we're seeing here a passing of what we might call the university, or at least perhaps we should call it the European university, in a way. Falling away, passing of the liberal university through privatisation, corporatisation. We all know the phrases, we all know the words. Neoliberalism, new public management. Are you familiar with that one? The ways in which the management of universities has become systematised, with management disciplines coming into universities from the private sector. Surveillance, measurement. All these now are features of the modern university. It'd be interesting to see how far they're features of a medieval founded university like Leuven. But I bet they're there. I bet they're coming on stream. Yes? So, what else? How else would we account for this apparent incoherence? Of course, the academic community has been playing its part over the last 50 years through philosophies of postmodernism, post-structuralism, a philosophy of incoherence, a sense that there is no stable place now for our own reasoning activities. And of course that's given an underpinning by people like Deleuze and Guattari with their extraordinary work and their lovely phrasing like lines of flight. A human being is no longer anchored in any way. It's going in all sorts of directions. It's become glassy, fluid. These are powerful metaphors to be found now in sociology and philosophy. And so we have a double undermining of the university as we originally understood it for 700 or 800 years until about 50 years ago, sociologically and philosophically. So I think we've got a dissolving idea of the university here. It's dissolving around us almost without us realising sometimes. And it's quite deep. It's not just, as it were, academic capitalism, as it's sometimes referred to. It's much deeper than that. It's as I say, it's a consequence of very powerful global forces at work. And the emergence, therefore, of what we might call the global university as an institution, in which differences, as it were, seem to be massaged. And universities now have to understand themselves as part of this global movement. As I say, we see these forms of the university developing worldwide, the corporate university, the entrepreneurial university, the digital university. Roy Basker talks about the deep structures of human being as being generative deep structures, and I think his philosophy of critical realism is really quite helpful here and quite powerful. And if that's the case, if any of what I've just been saying in the last few minutes has any weight, then the very notion of policy, it seems to me, becomes problematic. If we can talk about universities moving globally in certain identifiable directions, then what is policy against that horizon, against those reflections? It seems to me it's merely tinkering around at the edges with this global university envelope, with what the shaping, this global shaping of universities. So policy becomes, in different universities, in different countries, a bit more marketisation, a bit more entrepreneurialism, a bit more of the digital revolution, a bit more transnational effort, a bit more of the focus on students as customers. A little bit here, a little bit there, but the overall picture is unchanged, it seems to me, globally. So is it a policy framework that we're seeing, or that we can give voice to, or is it actually a policy vacuum? That is the question, seems to me, in front of us here. And some will say, but this is ridiculous. Higher education evinces diversity. Look at the universities within any national system. Don't we see increasing diversity? governments around the world very often are trying to stimulate diversity. I was in Canada recently, where you've got just that effort going on. And the UK government's always talking about diversity, heralds diversity in its system. But I think we need to get under the skin of that rhetoric about diversity. Because it seems to me that universities are rarely being encouraged actually to come forward with imaginative alternatives. Why did I write that book, Imagining the University? Precisely because it seems to me that in our public discourse and in the way universities are working today, they're devoid of imagination about what they could be. You know, if you could start with a blank sheet of paper, as it were, create a university afresh for the 21st century, and a completely blank sheet of paper, wouldn't one want to be imaginative and come forward with totally new ideas? But what I'm saying then is that the absence of real imagination, real innovative policy thinking, isn't accidental. Universities are expected, actually, to fall in line with their stated role, with their expected role as global universities. So, what possibilities are there? Could there be? Can we talk of possibilities, real, significant, new possibilities for the university? What is the possibility of possibilities? What might they look like? How could they come forward? What kind of imaginative creations might be possible? It seems to me we're at a cusp here. The university's been with us, at least in Europe, some Persians, the Indians, the Chinese will say it's actually been with us for 1,000 years. It's only in Europe for 700 or 800 years. It seems to me now, at this point in the 21st century, we are actually on a cusp here of the university either collapsing in upon itself and simply taking uncritically the role that's being cast for it within this global policy framework, or whether we can and might see universities becoming really imaginative about their possibilities and realising even, dare I say, utopian potential, the utopian potential that lies within universities. I'm an old-fashioned liberal. I still believe in the university. The university is an extraordinary institution, and if we didn't have it, we'd have to create it. But it seems to me we're falling short of what the university might be in the 21st century, falling short of living up to the responsibilities that are coming our way in the 21st century. Derrida asked the question precisely that. What can we actually talk of? His question was, can we actually talk of the very idea of responsibility in relation to the university? We don't hear that vocabulary anymore. The path is set for us. What does it mean for the university to have responsibilities and live up to them and live them out fresh and new in the 21st century? To talk in those terms actually brings in the sense that universities have a utopian potential that isn't being realised. One of my intellectual heroes, Ernest Gellner, a great European intellectual, no longer with us, talked in one of his books about the big ditch. The big ditch for him was, in effect, between a science-based society, based, if you like, on Western reason, and other sorts of society in which the values and virtues of Western reason weren't understood or heralded. It was a phrase of his, the big ditch. societies at some point have to decide where they're going. Perhaps we're coming into a stage where we have to make decisions about where we're going as a society. But here, focusing on the university, there are 2 or 3 big ditches opening up, it seems to me. We've got a big ditch between the university as institution and the university as idea. The university is just powering along in most countries. We were supposed to have a government white paper on higher education recently in the UK. I don't know whether you have something like that in Belgium. When policy is being pronounced, being developed, the government will come forward with a new policy statement on health or transport or education or whatever it might be. We call them in the UK white papers. We were supposed to have a white paper a few weeks or months ago on higher education. We're still waiting for it. In fact, it's been ditched. The government seems to be unable to think now imaginatively and strategically about higher education. If I'm going to be anecdotal, we have a Minister of Higher Education called David Willetts, and he's known as a bit of a thinker. Would you believe a Minister of the Crown who's known as a bit of a thinker? In fact, he's known as, in the jargon, 2 brains Willetts. He actually is somebody who thinks, you see, and he goes around talking to people. It's very unusual. And he was in charge of bringing forward this white paper. And he invited 3 or 4 of us into his room to talk about ideas about higher education, would you believe? Minister of the Crown wanting to think, being reflective about ideas of higher education, thinking about the university. Well, it's perhaps not altogether surprising. As I said, we're still waiting for that paper, still waiting for it to see the light of day. In fact, we understand on the grapevine that even if we had had a white paper on higher education in the UK, it certainly wouldn't have had the philosophical, reflective first chapter that David Willetts was wanting to have. His senior people in the government sat on that idea. So we've got a gap here opening up between the university as an institution and the university as an idea. Can we do any serious thinking about the university anymore? Are we allowed to do any thinking about the university anymore? So you've got a gap between the idea and the institution, but you've also got another gap then between how it is on the ground, how it is working today, how it's working in the next year or 2, and its possibilities well into the future. I played a tiny little part in a major national inquiry into UK higher education back in the mid-1990s. One of the features of that inquiry was to ask universities, and anybody who wanted to answer, where they thought universities should be in 20 years' time. It proved extremely difficult to get anything out of universities at all. They seemed to be, as it were, congenitally unable to think imaginatively about where they might be in 20 years' time. So we've got another gap here opening between a university as it is, its nitty-gritty, how it works day to day on the ground, its management, its systems. We can map all that very, very well. But thinking about the possibilities of the university seemed to be another order of thinking altogether that seemed very limited. And so we've got a third gap then between simply describing the university and imagining the university. It's not one big ditch, but I think 3 big ditches in front of us. Which means that for me, the university is always less than it might be. It's always falling short of what it can be, of its possibilities. There's always, and for me, the very idea of university is always looking to realise possibilities in human being and our relationships with each other, our relationships with the world, of which we're always falling short. So the very idea of the university reminds us about the possibilities of thinking about reality on the one hand and the very idea of the university, the reality of the university and its possibilities. Can we do that? Can we bring that into play? What would that look like? The university moves in all sorts of intricate spaces. So the question might be put in this way: what new spaces can open up for the university? What new spaces can the university move into in the 21st century that it's not occupying at the moment? In the UK, one of our leading universities is University College London, actually outperforms Oxford and Cambridge on some of the performance indicators. It's trying to take on board some of this thinking. Extraordinary, large, complex, world-famous institution. It's now developing wisdom as a theme for itself. It's trying to see itself as the university of wisdom. Now, we don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of what that might mean, but there you have a major institution doing some collective thinking about itself, about its possibilities, trying to open up projects, activities, through which the very concept of wisdom might come into play. David Backhouse, the philosopher, some of you may know of his work, has recently been talking about the space of reason and understanding educational institutions under this concept. That seems to be a fascinating concept. What might a university look like which tried to understand itself in terms of a space of reason? So we can identify possibilities for new thinking, I think, about the university. If we don't try to stand outside, be imaginative, bring new ideas into play and new spaces into play, the university as we know it will slip away. It's already slipping away in some ways. I expect you know that Deleuze and Guattari, their great book, 1,000 Plateaus, they've got a concept running through it of rhizome. The rhizome, I understand, is a fairly unstructured kind of biological entity. And they're using that as simply a metaphor to capture much of the fluidity that they play out in that extraordinary book of theirs. And that's the metaphor of the rhizomes attracted a lot of attention in social theory and philosophy as a result of that book. But it seems to me it's all very well as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. It seems to me a university, it's far too static. It seems to me a university is much more like a squid. A squid, it's long tentacles, can get everywhere, move very fast. It's got a hard shell. It seems to me we need new metaphors for the university these days. Metaphors that are sensitive to this fluidity of the university and yet can open up new possibilities for us, new thinking for us. The Vice-Chancellor of Warwick University, his name's Thrift, in a former incarnation, is one of the foremost social theorists in the UK. Be fascinated to know how he marries his social theory with his role as a Vice-Chancellor or Rector of a university. But in one of his books, he talks about thinking spaces, developing in new time-space arrangements. Isn't this how we need to understand the formation of knowledge these days? The development, the opening of new thinking spaces in new time-space arrangements. Spaces, he goes on, spaces of inspiration incorporating many possible worlds. There's a fluidity, isn't there, of thinking, of being, of engagement in the world. But where do we go with thinking of that kind if we want to take it on board and bring it into our thinking about the university? Can we still bring that kind of space-oriented thinking, fluidity-oriented thinking, can we bring it into play and still hang on to the idea of the university as a space of universals? Or do we just say no? Let it all go. Let every university do what it wants, so far as it can. Textures of the university, the perniciousness of measurement. Do you not find this these days? If it moves, it's got to be measured, and if it can't be measured, it's of no value. This seems to be part of the thinking of management in higher education these days. And what's the result of that kind of mechanical, measuring thinking? Isn't it that we're losing sight of possibilities again for the university? The very words, the vocabulary that we use to describe the university, to get a handle on it, is disappearing. When did we see in university web pages talk of beauty, of poetry, of graciousness, of integrity, of authenticity, of hope, of spirit? While these kinds of words coming into the web pages of universities around the world, there are silences, pernicious silences, through which we come to understand the university. I'm doing quite a lot of reading these days of Slavoj Žižek. You've got your head around any of his work. I find it quite challenging, I must say, with his Hegelian and background and building on Lacan. It's often a bit beyond me, but I'm wrestling with it because I think there's a lot of value there. One of his big concepts is that of parallax. What's he mean by parallax? He means bearing in on a situation where there are opposing perspectives such that they meet but fail to meet all at once. And he refers to the Moebius strip. Have I pronounced it correctly? Moebius strip. You know the Moebius strip? It's a film of paper, as it were, which turns in upon itself. So you have two planes interacting with each other, but yet and adjacent to each other, and yet not ever really properly coming into contact with each other. And that seems to me a lovely metaphor for the university in the 21st century. They're one and the same element in two different spaces. How can we play that out if we want to understand the university? The university is a series of events. When I'm teaching in front of a class and I have students in front of me, what's going on? How do we understand that event? Is it simply a transaction between a tutor and students? Is it that students are receiving? Is it that we're seeing the playing out of economic realities, students as customers, students becoming employable? I'm sure you have those sorts of, again, metaphors and themes playing out in Belgium. But it's an unlimited event, actually. There can be or should be no end to our descriptions of what is going on in that extraordinary space we call a classroom. An event, this is Badia, he's done a little book with Žižek. Badia says, an event is nothing but part of a given situation, nothing but a fragment of being. I love this kind of thinking because it gives us insights into the tiny little micro structures and activities that go on within universities. How do we understand them? There are all sorts of possibilities wrapped up in the microstructures of situations within universities. I want to say the university is schizophrenic. First argument to back up that claim. The university lives in the space between its facticity and its possibilities. It is real. Universities are real, massive institutions. University College London, £1 billion turnaround each year. They're massive institutions, they're real. But they also have possibilities. So there's a schizophrenia between the reality of a university and its ideas, and the ideas that might be entertained of it. But then there's a second development of that position, where we might want to say that the facticity of universities, their reality and their possibilities are not separate, but a part of the totality of universities. And isn't this the case? If we ask academics, I don't know about students, but if we ask academics about how do they feel about their working lives, why do they come into work, what fires them up, what gets them going? When they might say some critical things about the way things are in university, but very often they'll say, well, I'm here because I can see possibilities in my students. Don't they say that? Or I'm here because I can see possibilities for my research. So academics themselves, in their daily lives, are looking into the future, seeing possibilities playing out. And they keep going despite all the difficulties and the problems that university life faces, because of their hopes and values for the future. So the idea and the possibilities are part of the same entity. Third development of that position, that the university is both pernicious and ideal all at once. I want to say, I've claimed in one of my books, that the university is a set of pernicious spaces. It damages us in some ways. It limits our reasoning. It limits the way we can understand each other. Limits the way we engage with the wider world. But it's ideal because we see these ideals lurking there, actually, day in and day out, in the way people greet each other, pass each other in the corridor, in the way in which they have sandwich lunches and talk about real things concerning academic life. The university is both pernicious and ideal all at once. The critical university gains its force by being pitted against its opposite. In other words, people want to say, can we still talk about the university as a critical force or space in society? And I say, it's still there. It's still there. You've got to find it. It's still lurking. Even though the university is becoming entrepreneurial, corporate, bureaucratic, still there are spaces of hope and possibility in the university. So the university is full of schizophrenia. One or two quick quotes, I won't go through all of this, it would be tedious. But I'm fascinated with the way in which Zizek is playing with the idea of negativity, which he takes from Hegel, I think. And it seems to me we have to recognise that the university is a set of negativities if we're going to really help the university to achieve its possibilities in the world. Universalities Zizek has not written about the university, hardly at all. I found one paper of his on the university. But he's writing about universality. Universality is not the neutral container of particular formations, their common measure, but this battle itself, the struggle leading from one particular formation to another. It seems to me that in this sort of language, this sort of insight, we have possibilities for the university. The university can go on succeeding itself, achieving itself more in the future. But it has to keep these ideas alive in different ways. For Hegel, external circumstances are not an impediment to realising inner potentials, but on the contrary, the very arena in which the true nature of these inner potentials is to be tested. Now, Zizek did not have the university in mind when he wrote that, but it seems to me it captures absolutely the character and the situation of universities today. That universities are struggling with this inherent contradictions, set of contradictions between what they are and what they could be. And when we talk about the university being critical, it seems to me that it's only because the university is falling back, is corrupting itself, that the very idea of the critical university can play out fully and authentically. The university proves itself as a critical university by turning itself against itself. Is that possible? Can we... one reads the reports on what's going on in universities around the world. People are not allowed to speak out anymore. Do you have that? Do you see any signs of that in Belgium? We have to work with these contradictions that are within the university to realise the possibilities that still are there in the university. And so I want to say that the university is an inherently antagonistic institution. Inherently antagonistic. But there are different antagonisms at work here. You've got the university battling against external forces. But you've also got this more intangible set of antagonisms that I've been trying to wrestle with here with you today. The antagonisms that lie deep within its soul, if you like. The antagonisms that lie deep in its structures, in its activities. As I say, when I'm teaching, do I have a hope that these students, that these actions, which we call a classroom, add up to the students becoming better human beings? Or are they simply going to become, as it were, units for the global economy? Antagonisms lie deep in the structures and activities of the university. So you have the university in effect battling against itself. I don't see any other hope for the university. There's going to be no sunny situation where we can come through all this and think, if only we get it right, we can go on living the values that held true, say, 50 or 100 years ago. There's no such situation available to us. At best, all there is are these tricky, difficult, awkward contradictions, this antagonistic situation, this situation of schizophrenia. So I want to say now that this wrestling with these big ideals is a real struggle. It's a real struggle because of these forces that are at work inside universities. No internal struggle, no university. Unless the university has a space for these internal struggles, the university is no more. The university has to live with its inherent antagonisms. The reality is that university is less than its possibilities. It's always falling short. And therefore, if we care about universities, we are going to have to care about management and leadership. And leadership becomes a way of helping the university address these antagonisms that are within it. But what about the university as a site of universalities? There are competing universalities, it seems to me, that come within the orbit of universities. Reason, equity, the idea of a public, wisdom, ecology even, liberty. These are some of the big themes and ideals, are they not, that have been associated with universities. Some more recent than others, some only just coming into view, like ecology. Big universal ideals and ideas that perhaps have something to say to the university. But perhaps one needs to say that these universals are themselves suspect. Perhaps they're simply the voices of Western reason. Perhaps we need to find other ideals for the university, bearing in mind its antagonisms, its schizophrenia. What about exhilaration, anxiety, excitement, boundary breaking, rule breaking? Perhaps we need different kinds of metaphors of being in the world, being with each other. So we have competing universalities. There's no one single set of universalities here to which we can hold on to. So what can we conclude, if anything, just by way of its temporary set of conclusions? I want to say, first of all, that the very idea of policy that we started with, rather than opening up possibilities, will tend to close debate and close possibilities, because policy tends to take for granted a certain set of assumptions about the university as part of the global university. And it pretends to a unity, a shared understanding amongst us, on the one hand, that on the other hand, it seems to me, it is highly problematic. It's a set of assumptions that run against the very idea of the university as an open space, a space for conflict, a space for raw debate. So I'd say we need to give up the term policy, but I'm not sure what we might replace it with, to be honest. I'm myself at a crossroads here in relation to this issue. What I am clear about is that we need to stimulate universities so that they can imagine and reimagine themselves in fundamentally new ways, so that we have universities developing and ideas about the university that are developing that are adequate to the university of the 21st century. But those ideas themselves will have to go on being interrogated. We need to find imaginative resources to help us engage with what it is to be a university in the 21st century. I'm not sure how we bring that about, to be honest. It seems to be a fundamental challenge in front of us today. Where do we find the imaginative resources on the one hand? And secondly, how do we engender a public debate or a public space in which imaginative thinking is valued and legitimate? Well, thanks very much for listening to me. It's been a bit of a gallop, but there it is. Let's have some discussion. Thanks very much.
And of course, recognize a lot of tendencies and tensions as you mentioned them. And I also can follow the call for a kind of imagination. I would just be interested in, could you say something more about, let's say, your imagination? So what do you imagine as a kind of possibilities? What could be very concrete examples of a kind of university that would deal with the issues that you
It's a fair question. Did you all hear the question? So what have I got up my sleeve, as it were? Can I offer an imaginative idea? And can I be very concrete? Those are two challenges. I can have a go at the first one. I'm not so sure about the second one. In other words, I do have an idea, which I've been developing recently in some papers, which I'm calling the ecological university. What do I mean by ecological? I mean a university that is aware of its interrelationships with the world in the fullest way. It's a university that understands not just that it has responsibilities, and here I use the term responsibility,
not just that he has responsibilities towards sustaining the world. You know that sustainability is one of the big concepts of the ecologists, but that this university, the ecological university, recognises it has resources for and responsibilities for improving the world. Improving the world. Of course, then that raises all sorts of difficult questions about what it might mean to improve the world. But the ecological university is going to be sensitive to the ways in which, the multiple ways in which it engages with the world. It engages with persons, students and other people as persons, not just as economic units, but as persons. It engages with communities, engages with epistemological communities, as well as social communities. Some universities in India, for example, are out there in the community, engaging with real-life social, educational and health projects, putting their resources to work in the community. And universities are inevitably and properly global institutions. I don't have any difficulty with them being global institutions. On the contrary, if they're going to play out their universality, they need to be global. So there are issues about how the university can fulfill its responsibilities in the world. And I turn to this concept of ecology because it seems to me to offer all sorts of possibilities which can be taken up. I'm connected with a tiny little university college, not yet a university, in southwest London. Very tiny. It has a little department of dance, and it takes its students off each year to Malawi, and it gets them putting on performances for people in rural communities in Malawi. That seems to me another little example of how the ecological university can reach out and work for the improvement of society. But it can work in all sorts of ways. It can work through student projects. It can work through academics coming to understand themselves much more as public intellectuals, engaging with the world, and not just with their own little disciplined community. The ecological university can work through forming links with the world through its networks in all sorts of ways. Flesh needs to be put on the bone, so to speak. And you need to do this for every department, in every faculty, in every university. Because what's going to be possible for the Department of Law will be different from that's possible for the Department of Anthropology. So I'm very wary about trying to, as it were, come up with a blueprint. I'm wary about blueprint utopias, as they're called in the literature. I'm much more interested in utopian ideas that lend themselves to interpretation in all sorts of different situations and which can go on emerging over time. I mentioned Roy Basker and critical realism. One of his big concepts is that of emergence. Can we find ways of looking at the world and helping to form the world, develop the world, that are susceptible to further emergence over time as situations change? So that's one idea that I have. But I'm reluctant in a way to push that too hard, although I hope I might get round to writing the book on it one day. I've written 4 or 5 papers. Because what I want more than that is to try and stimulate others to come up with ideas, which could actually be around. In that book, Imagining the University, I've identified about 50 ideas of the university lurking in the literature. We're actually not short of ideas about the university in the literature. But the question I say, or the statement I make in that book is, it's not that we need more ideas of the university, we need better ideas of the university. So we need to be able to test imaginative ideas actually, when you get down to it, well, imagination is quite difficult, but that's not enough. It's necessary but not sufficient, as the philosophers would say. We need to be able to test our ideas, to see whether they're robust, to see whether they have scope, to see whether they have this quality of emergence, to see whether they're feasible, to see whether they could actually gain traction in the real world. So thinking about the university has to be this juxtaposition of ideas and practicality. So my own personal idea is that of the ecological university because it seems to me to offer possibilities, further imaginative possibilities. But I'm reluctant about pressing it too hard. So I want you all to try to imagine the university afresh.
You also
Thank you very much. I've been appreciating this lecture. You've been talking about 3 ditches, 3 gaps, and then you have described the metaphor university as a parallax. And I had a question on that. I'm not familiar with the concept of parallax, that's why I'm asking extra explanation. So does it mean that those 2 parts exclude each other and that they will never coincide? And as a consequence that we will have to learn to live with the schizophrenic situation? Or is it differently?
It's exactly that. I mean, it seems to me this is how a university is these days. It seems to me it is a set of closures. I'm delighted that I'm no longer on the staff of the university. I'm supposed to be, quotes, retired. What does that mean? It means I still am on the email system, but it means I can zap the bureaucratic emails, and it means I don't have to go into those bureaucratic attachments. I mentioned that in the UK and USA, there are more bureaucrats or non-academics in universities than there are academics. So universities are schizophrenic, it seems to me. They are both spaces of closure, but they're also spaces of opening and liberation. And this is the character of the contemporary university. It's full of contradictions, and which are there all the time. It's both closure and it's opening, all at the same time. We have to hang on to that idea, that it is both. If we don't hang on to that idea, I'm afraid that the pernicious forces are going to overrun. We see profound issues around the world about the future of the humanities, for example. Have you got that debate yet in Belgium? It may be in continental Europe you're still valuing the humanities. But coming out of America, there are a whole stream of books, really with titles along the lines, The Crisis of the Humanities. So we are schizophrenic, and these formations within the university are there. They're real. They're very, very real, and they're there at the same time, one next to each other, as it were. There are a lot of academics, colleagues who write about the university these days in social theory and philosophy are full of gloom and doom. You see the titles of the books: The Crisis of the University, The University in Ruins. I don't write books with those sorts of titles. I don't write books with those sorts of orientation. It's easy to describe the pernicious aspects of universities these days: their entrepreneurialism, their bureaucracy, their instrumentalism. It's easy to write up that story of performativity, of neoliberalism, of performance indicators. The much more challenging thing is to try to identify the spaces for possibilities which are still there in the university, and to see how we can build on them in terms of our ideas, build on them in terms of our new thinking about formations within the university. So, as I say, it's not that we can wave, if one was a tyrant for the day, we could wave a magic wand. It's not as if one can, as it were, overcome these forces of negativity. They're very powerful. But the question is, how are we going to live with them? And what are the spaces for living with them? I don't know whether you feel this. I mean, it may be in continental Europe, actually, you're still very enlightened. You see? But in the UK and in America, I'm afraid things are a bit more serious, perhaps. And it may be that I'm speaking a language and painting a picture that you're not so easily recognising. You have much more of a sense in continental Europe than we have in the UK of the public sphere, of the public good that universities perform. You have a willingness on the part of the state and the taxpayer to subsidise higher education in a way we now haven't got anymore in the UK. Students are now responsible in the UK for paying the whole of their fees. So maybe the picture I'm painting is a little bit more gloomy, a bit more difficult, a bit more awkward than you're finding it. It may be that everything's hunky-dory in Belgium, and in continental Europe, but you have to tell me.
On the contrary, I would say that I recognize our own institution very much in what you described. And what I like so much is that on the one hand, you give the description of all different aspects that we find also in Europe. And then that you also bring a kind of message of hope to find the cracks in which, or the spaces in which we can do something, hopefully. Actually, this morning we had a meeting with some colleagues thinking about a new vision, and this with the vice rector of a new vision on education within the university. So it's really a space where people can bring ideas, and at the end of the meeting, we had exactly the questions that you raised. Because on one hand, there is a lot of imagination and ideas, but then you have these enormous forces, with not only outside, but within the university, that actually determine what we are doing. So the question was, we should not be too disappointed, because it's nice to have nice ideas and then to be confronted with reality, which is extremely oppressive, to put it in that way. My question is a little bit, so how to behave in such a situation? You stress imagination, you see some people with ideas, we are in these concrete situations. You mentioned at a certain moment the kind of global discursive regime. So I was wondering that one of the aspects would not also be that we have to change our discourses. And so that one, again, very simple contribution is not only to be imaginative, but also in all kinds of meetings and where we are, and in public debate, but also in classrooms, that we try to change our own discourse. Because maybe that's also a possibility of change. I don't know what you think of what kind of discourse we could adopt.
Well, absolutely. Thank you very much for all of that. And I'm very sensitive, if I can say so, to what you're saying. we have to think very carefully about the words we use, and we have to think about the micropolitics of the very words we use. What is going to carry the day? What words can I use that are going to, as it were, serve my values, my hopes? Hope, by the way, is a very powerful concept for me. On the one hand, but also latch onto, link into, engage with, hook into the bureaucratic perspectives, the managerial perspectives, the economic perspectives, which are serving this global discourse that I'm talking about. Is that possible? Is it possible to find a communicative bridge between those of us who still care about the university, on the one hand, see that it has possibilities and responsibilities in the 21st century, and yet bridge across to these real forces, discursive forces, economic forces, that are actually structuring universities worldwide. This is a real big issue. So we have to be alert to how we conduct ourselves, how we communicate with our students, what kind of pedagogical relationships we want with our students, but also, as I say, how we understand ourselves. To what extent do we see ourselves as public intellectuals, engaging with the wider world, speaking in a language that the wider world can understand, being prepared to go out of the university, yes, into the radio, TV studios, writing the popular magazines. Are we prepared to do all that? And find a language that others can understand? This is so very important, it seems to me. It's not easy stuff at all. Very, very difficult. And I'm not pretending it's all going to come well. On the contrary. The very idea of utopia has a pessimistic element to it. Precisely because it's out there, it's not the very idea. Is it Greek or Greek? I think it means no place. It means that it's not realisable. And the kind of ecological university that I've started to sketch out is probably not going to be realised. But what's nice about the kind of utopias I'm interested in, I call them feasible utopias. Feasible utopias, contradiction in terms. Why feasible? Because we can actually see, if we look hard enough, look into the microstructure of departmental life, teaching life, research life. We can see little examples of what one might call the ecological university. So it's a feasible utopia. So we have to work at it. These things are not easy. And indeed, the very concept of hope suggests that our values are worth, as it were, fighting for, pushing for, working at, even though the world that they represent may not be with us, may not ever be with us. But we still have spaces to work in. Not easy stuff at all. A lot of politicking.
I was just wondering whether in your search for feasible utopias, there was a place for the history of the university. And if so, if you could elaborate a little bit on that.
What a lovely question. Well, you'll notice, didn't you, that I referred to the history of universities once or twice in my talk. It seems to me we can't understand how to go forward unless we know where we've come from. And that's, I used to be a student of medieval university. It's a fascinating story. How did they get going? Why did they get going? And why did Oxford and Cambridge end up as Oxford and Cambridge rather than Reading and Stanford? So they could have become equally marshy places out of London. Miserable places, doubtless in the 12th century. So we have to acknowledge our history. And I was asking earlier, what is the history of Leuven. And not only when did it come into being, but what is its, as it were, ecclesiastical history been? What is its relationship with the Catholic Church? And what's its relationship now, and how has that evolved over time? How is it evolving? We can't identify real possibilities. And as I keep coming back to this idea of the remember I had one slide I called the possibility of possibilities. That is a play on words, but it's a real play on words. What is really possible? We can't work out what is really possible for this university as distinct from that university unless we have a sense of its history. Very, very important. But I'm afraid this is another problem in policy life these days. If you talk to the bureaucrats and you talk to the civil servants, their history doesn't go back more than 10 years, if that. There's a historical myopia. Well, again, perhaps it's different in Belgium. Perhaps you've got very enlightened civil servants who know their history. And when they're trying to form policy of higher education, perhaps they do have a sense of the history of higher education. But I tell you, that isn't the case in the UK. There is no historical way. History, for them, means anything before about 1990. And it's a blank sheet. They've got no idea at all. And how can you form policy in the UK without having a sense, even if it's recent history, say since the Second World War, let alone going back to medieval times? So, that's a very nice question, but do you want to say a bit more? What's in the back of your mind?
I was just thinking about whether the times we are experiencing now are radically different than what people might have experienced in the Middle Ages. I mean, we now have entrepreneurialism, but back then they of course had a religious system where the university had to function within. And I was just wondering if you could perhaps say a little bit more about how, according to you, the tensions and difficulties we are experiencing right now are comparable or perhaps different with the fact that in the Middle Ages a university had to function within a religious system which also, I can imagine, I'm not an expert in the history of universities, but directed the university in a particular way.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I'm glad I followed it up and invite you to say a little bit more. Because you're asking a question that I keep asking myself. Really, I'll wander around. There are occasionally one or two thoughts going on in one's mind. And that is the kind of question I've got to myself. Are things really different now? I gave you, I don't know whether you noticed in one of my slides, I tried to develop with you a conceptual distinction that I was making between internalist conceptions of the university and externalist conceptions of the university. And the undergraduate essay might run that we've seen a shift in the last 50 years from internalist conceptions of the university to externalist conceptions of the university. We now are only allowed to think of the university in terms of its economic function, the economic goods that it's not even social goods, but economic goods that the university is supplying. But the more nuanced question, perhaps at postgraduate level then, is to say, or to ask precisely your question as to whether things are really that different. Because even then, the universities in their earliest formation were guided by, influenced by the Pope, or in England the Crown, and it was a bit of both. And the Pope and the King, whoever it was, seemed to fall over themselves to grant their medieval universities, newly formed, all sorts of privileges and autonomy. So you could say that even then there was a tension between internal conceptions of the university and external conceptions. So is anything new today? Well, I'm not sure. I think there is. I feel there is. I feel one has to say, yes, it is new, it is different. You didn't have the global forces that I've been talking about are genuinely global. This digital revolution that we are in the midst of. And, I'm sure you're all familiar with MOOCs, yes, talking that language in Belgium. These massive online open courses. Many universities around the world now are finding ways of putting all their goodies into the public domain free of charge, research and teaching. But as I say, you see the digital revolution going on in all sorts of ways, in teaching, in research, administration. And I think it's connected with the development of the global economy. So I think there are new massive global forces at work, which we have to try and understand if we're going to understand the character of the contemporary university, its challenges and its possibilities. I feel that we are into a new age, but I think looking back is always very constructive and poses us challenges, brings us up short, because that question keeps coming back to haunt one. Is there anything really new about today?
I have a question about the policy issue. Because on the one hand, in the beginning of your presentation, you were arguing there is a kind of global university model. Policy actually is not only policy, but just adapting here and there small bits. So there is no more room for policy. But at the same time, in the final slide, you are arguing we don't need policy. So I was thinking, do we need a new kind of policy, or is policy itself the problem? Or you could say that once upon a time, when they invented public policy, to change things. It was a tool for social change, for changing organizations, but also changing society, and to resist what was perceived as forces, that we no longer are exposed to forces, that we can handle it ourselves. And you could say that policy in a way was invented to resist those things. So my question is, do we need to reinvent university policy or academic policy, or try to find another way of changing the university?
Thanks again for the question. I've worn various T-shirts when I've been in university. One of them was to be pro-director for longer-term strategy at the London Institute of Education. London Institute of Education conducts about 1/3 of all educational research in the UK, 800 PhD students. In education, it's one of the leading 2 or 3 schools in the world. So it has a global position. And I was invited to be the pro-director for longer-term strategy, where I was invited to actually be the lead drafter of a new strategy document for the Institute. And it got me thinking precisely about this matter in a very practical way. So I try and pretend to be a philosopher, I also try and keep my feet on the ground, head in the clouds and feet on the ground all at once. So I reflected that at its best, a university strategy is what I called in one of my books a set of hopeful fictions. Because it should have, it seems to me, if it's working at its best, it should have a kind of far-seeing quality to it, such that with the world moving the way it is, fluid, fast-moving, dynamic, unpredictability, it will have a non-realizable character to it. So what is the point of emerging with a policy with a long-term horizon under those circumstances? Precisely because it brings hope into play in our institutions. So I want our policy makers and our strategists to have their feet on the ground. Universities are real places. They have to be financially secure, for example. Philosophers never talk about financial security. But they also should have this, as I say, this aspect, this element of free thinking. But it's hard work because it has to attend to the realities of this institution with its history, in this place, in this country, in this framework, with these sorts of institutions around it. So I think there still is a need for policy, but it will be a different kind of policy. It will be imaginative, it will be far-thinking, it will be opening up questions, awkward questions. But this is a real issue. I teach on an MBA course we have at the Institute of Education in Higher Education Management. And it's virtually the first issue that we get the students tackling. What is policy or strategy these days under these conditions of turbulence, when the world is moving so fast? Does it help to have a policy? Just let things go. I mean, what is the point of it? It's only going to bind you up in what is a dynamic situation when you need to be very open to the challenges that are coming up, which you can't see anyway. But I think there is value in trying to think systematically about possibilities, bringing hope into play, bringing values into play. So there's going to be many, many elements coming into play in this kind of policy, of poetry, of imagination, but of realism. As I've been doing a lot of intellectual work with Roy Basker's critical realism. And the philosophy there is to remind us that there is an ontology, as it were, to the world. The world is composed of real things, but they're moving in a dynamic space at different levels. And this seems to be a game to be part of the university. You have to acknowledge its history, acknowledge its structuring in the world, but then see its possibilities and try and work them out in the nitty-gritty of institutional life. So that's a kind of round-the-houses answer to the question. I think we do need policy, but it needs to be a different, more fanciful kind of policy. I'd be interested to know what it's like in Belgium. I mean, does any of this talk resonate at all with you in Belgium? And what are the conflicts? What are the antagonisms? What are the differences? What's the debate like in Belgium? Do you have different universities seeing themselves having quite different positions? Do you have a sense of what a university is these days in Belgium? I'm just fascinated to hear and see how things are working out on the ground. Do you have any imaginative voices in Belgium these days in higher education? Is it all very instrumental? Is it all, where do we get the money from? How do we give more to industry? You notice in my talk, if I can say so, I didn't mention skills. I didn't even mention learning. And I didn't hardly mention teaching, only a few times. I think we've got to break out of the conventional vocabulary, find new words. That's why I'd like to read a little bit of poetry. Another life I'm going to be a poet. We've got to find new words, new concepts, new ways of looking into the world. I'm fascinated by poets. They can look at something, like a leaf or something, or a pig, and they can see it. They look at it intensely, and they display, they illuminate it for us, quite new ways. Well, we need to do that with the university, it seems to me. Otherwise, we're going to enclose ourselves with the thinking of the age, the dominant discourses of the age. Alistair McIntyre talked about the self-images of the age. If we're not careful, that's how we will frame the university, just as an economic unit, which is not unimportant at all. But I want to see what else is possible. And what other responsibilities the university has. Don't you feel this? I mean, you open the newspaper, you look at what's going on in the world, you see the difficulties. Should the genders be segregated in a lecture hall? Have you got that debate going on in Belgium? Do you know what I mean? Have you heard about it? In some Muslim societies, on some campuses in the UK, it is said that the genders are being segregated by student societies. And the question is, what does the university do about it, if anything? What does the university do about a situation in which it finds some radical movements going on? These are real issues that we have to face. And the language of seeing the university simply as an economic powerhouse in society isn't going to address these very real issues that we have to face. We can only do them if we have a set of values, a set of ideals as to what the university is and could be. But although history is very important, we can't simply go back. We can't go back to Humboldt. We can't go back to Newman. We have to go on into the 21st century. It's new challenges, new world, new difficulties. It's tricky stuff.
Even then, you need a kind of minimal description of what a university is. I mean, one of the tensions I think also in Belgium, I think we recognize a lot of these things, but one of the tensions is also between research and teaching, research and education. But that comes close to a kind of minimal definition of what a university is. Is each institution for higher learning is that a university? Or shouldn't we bother about that? Should there be a minimal link between the two? Or is that too much relying on old concepts? So I was wondering, is it necessary to have a kind of minimal definition?
I mean, I'd love, if this was a workshop, I'd get out a lot of post-its, and you all have a post-it, and you'd all answer that question. Do you have a minimal concept of what a university is? And it's a very nice question. It's a difficult question. In a fluid, changing age, should we just back off from a question like that? Because once you start talking about a set of key concepts, a core university, you're then in effect talking about responsibilities. And the bureaucrats and the planners and the rectors shy away from thinking about responsibilities. But there was lurking in my talk actually a glimmer of a core concept. Remember I referred to David Bakhurst, who was drawing on Wilfrid Sellers, of the university as a space of reason. Actually, they're talking about educational institutions in general. But that seems to be a very important phrase. But what does it mean for the university to be a space of reason in the 21st century? just mentioned one or two examples. Visiting lecturers, visiting speakers who are preaching hate, who are preaching radicalism. What does it mean to be a space of reason in the 21st century? How far do we go? How do we play that out? These are not easy issues at all. But it seems to me that's a phrase that I want to hang on to, would want to hang on to. But responsibilities expand, going back to what is new. If the universities are global, if they're digital, if they're concerned with the world and active in the world, then they have to acknowledge their responsibilities to the world. So it's no good just being, as it were, an old-fashioned medieval little space of reason. Here we are, we've got a little space of reason, very nice. That's no longer adequate, no longer sufficient. This idea of the space of reason has to be totally reinterpreted for a new age, a 21st century age, a digital age. We have to be, and this is why MOOCs have their value. Universities putting their wares out into the world so that people can access the university through teaching, through research. University of Oxford is not untypical. In astronomy, archaeology, has such huge, vast data sets. It's not only putting all of that stuff into the public domain, it's saying to the public, have a look at this, see what you make of it. See what else you can find. Come and join us. Be part of this research enterprise. So we have to interpret a nice, homely little phrase like a space of reason in really imaginative ways, difficult ways, awkward ways. Because it means we have to go out into the wider world, engage with the wider world. So that would be one idea. But as I say, every idea you latch onto comes freighted with its difficulties. So,
Yeah, I had a question on what you just said. Do I get it right that you just mentioned that the university has a responsibility to mention or to express its idea on what the university is? Or is that an interpretation of mine?
Well,
So,
keep going.
because the university, needs to have his own opinion on what university is or what a university is. That's right. Then a second step there is you can use that same phrase on what do you see as the university. So if the university needs to have an opinion, then isn't it each one of us that has the responsibility on having an opinion on what university is?
Absolutely. And this is why I talked about leadership. I mentioned leadership. What is it to lead this kind of university, which is both antagonistic on the one hand, and yet wants to form imaginative ideas about itself? A responsibility falls on the university itself to think seriously about itself, imaginatively about itself. But it also follows from what I've been saying, doesn't it? That it's not just a matter within the university. It will be a collaborative effort with the wider society. The university is going to be playing out responsibilities, fulfilling responsibilities in relation to the wider society, being ecological in that sense. Then it will want to be sensitive to possibilities that others may see in the wider society of the university. So it can't be the university simply talking to itself by itself, although that's difficult enough anyway. You have debates in the University of Leuven, serious debates about the future of the university, who is able to engage in them. When I was forming that corporate strategy at the Institute of Education, I got the senior professors in the Institute around lunchtime tables in small groups with the desk staff, the most junior staff of the university.
The people who are on the desk when you come into a university, portering staff. How about that? Forming the university into a collective debate where everybody feels involved. That doesn't very much happen, I fear, in universities. Why doesn't it happen? It's a waste of time, it seems, for the managers. It's downtime. The bean counters will be counting up the number of people at those events, the number of hours that they are at those events, and thereby the cost of those events in straightforward accounting process. You can't count the value to a university of those sorts of events in purely financial terms, in immediate financial terms. So that this is where the different discourses of the university come into play. So there is a role for leadership here, there is a role for management, not against management, but it needs to be the right kind. It needs to be a management that is attentive to the concerns and issues of academics, quite apart from students. And a leadership that actually does have a concern for the possibilities of the university. But it's not just an internal debate, it's a big internal debate, but it's not just an internal debate. It's a debate that is conducted with the wider world, and not just employers, but the wider world. Is that a message? You know, there are opportunities for all of us. We've got to seize the spaces that there are. Each one of us has spaces. I ended up with one of my books with a sentence along these lines. It was a book about ideology in the university, how we live or might live with ideology in the university. And the last sentence was something along these lines: the smile in the corridor is a rebuke to the ideologists. We just engage with each other in a human way. That's an exercise into the heart of this kind of instrumental, narrow managerial that we see. We have spaces. The question is, can we really bring them off and realise them fully?
Okay. So no further questions. I would like to thank you again for your message, also with hope, and I would make a connection with Christmas. I'm not going to do that, but I would like to thank you for your very interesting, inspiring